Hi, folks. My name is Cristina, and I'm the CEO here at Pandium. And I've worked on integrations used by hundreds of SaaS companies and hundreds of thousands of businesses across all different industries, and wanted to share some of our hot tips for folks who are building integrations right now. So we're going to go through 5 tips that are pretty agnostic when it comes to the industry and even the size of company, things that we've seen over the years trip people up, just to give you guys a head start. So first, number 1. Get the system right. So this sounds like this would be table stakes, right? Like, oh, I got to integrate to XYZ system, easy peasy, go to their website, find the API docs, be done. But in a world of cloud-hosted software, there is still a need to understand what version of a system you're potentially integrating to. So if you've been in the space for a while, you can tell when someone says that they have an SAP integration or a Sage integration, that is not a complete statement. Systems like Sage, SAP, Oracle, even QuickBooks have a variety of versions. And the connectivity options for those versions, as well as the deployment environments for those versions, can vary wildly. Something like QuickBooks even still has on-prem versions. QuickBooks Online is a cloud-hosted software, but there are multiple versions of that. SAP has dozens of different types of systems under that parent umbrella, and every single one of those has different ways that it can be deployed on-prem or into the cloud, and different connectivity options based not just on the type of system, but also the specific point version. So it's really important when someone asks you at your company, or when a customer is asking you, or when an executive is asking you to build an SAP or a Sage integration, that you really understand what version of that system these folks are talking about, and what makes sense for your customers, and also what's going to be most commercially valuable to your business. Number 2, this sounds like a very straightforward one, but I've seen this trip us up before. I've seen it trip up other folks. Make sure you have working credentials and appropriate access to the system you're building an integration to. So again, this sounds like common sense. Like, of course, we need to be able to access the API. But really and honestly, having API access is not enough. What you need is an environment to test again, hopefully not production, API access or access to whatever type of service you're integrating to, and login credentials to the UI. Trying to build an integration without being able to log into the system and access it the way your customers are going to access it is nearly impossible. Can it be done going blind, just using API docs? Sure. But data can behave differently when it's entered in via a UI versus accessed via an API. And your customers are going to be the ones that are using this thing most likely through the application layer. So you've got to make sure that you have credentials to the system, that you have all the permissions that you need to access all of the objects that you need, and that you can log in to an environment that you can test against. Additional, if you're able to get access to a test environment that is preceded with data, that would be incredible. NetSuite is great about this. Their sandbox environments have a bunch of pretty good, robust data in there that makes testing so much easier. But at a minimum, even if it's an empty account, you've got to be able to log in. Do not get started. Do not pass go. Do not start trying to do anything until you have access to that environment. Number 3. So understand the real data needs that your customers have. So in a perfect world, data would be open and flow freely across applications instantly. It'd be updated in both places. There would be no latency. There'd be no ETL. We have all these API standards that everyone's going to be using, but that is not the reality of where we live today. Integrations have to live within the confines of not only the data models and the technical environment that you have, but also that of your partner systems. So that means that you could be encountering data access limits, throughput bottlenecks, inconsistent coverage across different types of endpoints. Maybe there's webhooks for some and not for others, et cetera. And those limitations can mean that all the data in all the places updated instantly is not a realistic expectation. If you are thinking about building an integration that is syncing transactions or historic data in any way, it's easy to say like, yeah, we'll just sync every transaction since the beginning of time, because then the customers will be happy and there will be no need to ever go back. And it's like a very straightforward thing to be syncing all that data. However, do you really need 30 years of sales order history? Do you really need 200,000 customer records when there's only 30,000 that have been active in the last 5 years? Or would it be sufficient to allow your customers just to have historic data for the last 5 years or 10 years, or allow them to filter the type of data that they're interested in getting into your system? All of these things will make the integration more bulletproof because it's not trying to sync data from the beginning of time that you may never need. It'll also save your system from having to store all of that erroneous data for no reason, and it will make using your system even easier. Plus, syncing billions of records will almost always take a long time, even if you have bulk endpoints, maybe your partner doesn't, or vice versa. It's really just challenging to do really large syncs. And I have definitely seen folks that have let syncs run for many hours, sometimes days, to try to get all of that data into one system, inevitably to find out that it failed somewhere in there, having to wipe the whole thing and start over. I would then bring it back to the question, like, do you really need all of that data? Because if your customers only really need or only care about the last 5 years, 10 years, whatever, there's no reason for you to be storing that and putting yourself through that crazy exercise of trying to get all that synced over. One thing that we very often implement and recommend is what we call a look back date, which is a configuration option that your customers get to then select the date from which they want historic data to sync. So you start with the most recent data when you start your first sync, and you work your way backwards until you hit a specific date. You can even hard code that date or put limits around that date. Same thing goes for filters. Like, hey, maybe you don't need to sync every customer record out of Salesforce. You can implement a custom field that says like sync to Acme, and then filter based on that custom field so that you're not going back since the beginning of time to look at customers that are no longer even active within that system. Number 4, pick the right integration pattern. So lots of companies, partner systems have a bunch of different ways to interact with their APIs. So probably a REST API, could have a SOAP API. Maybe they have some sort of SFTP flat file thing. Lots of folks now have webhooks and other kinds of event-based triggers. But that does not mean that you have to use all of those things. So to speak to our previous point, it's really important that you know what your data requirements are. If you do need historic data, building an integration that's webhooks only is probably not going to work for you. If you really need kind of this discrete response very quickly to single transactions, maybe doing a pass-through request where you're going directly to the API is sufficient to the partner system, but that's not going to work if you need to be doing heavy-duty filtering because the latency is going to be too high. If you need this data to be very resilient when it's syncing, webhooks probably not the best pattern because they can be a little flaky, and the retry logic does exist in some places, but a lot of the times it doesn't. So thinking about things like data volume, reliability, API coverage, as I mentioned before, like, do you actually have webhooks for every type of event, or do you have to refer back to like a cron-based or manual sync, data freshness requirements, and then also your own internal infrastructure all come into play when you're thinking about how you want to design integrations. One thing that we do like to mention about webhooks, especially if you're building this in-house and not using a tool like Pandium, is thinking about storing webhooks, debouncing, things like that. Those are the types of things that maybe don't come up in your initial testing, but when you get out into the real world and your partner system was down for 5 minutes and now they're replaying all the webhooks that they should have sent you, those types of things like caching and having a message queue, et cetera, can actually be really important. And that's also why we think about doing a combination of these patterns oftentimes when you're thinking about real-time data access, event-driven integrations, as well as doing cleanups or doing initial syncs that have that historic data. Finally, number 5, have an opinion. So integrations are a feature of your product, right? Your customers think of them as something that you're building and supporting, but there's a twist because there's a requirement not just to understand your side of the equation, but also to understand this other system and how your customers are using it. So that can mean more work, not just for the person that's designing the integration, but also potentially the person that is building it. You have to understand what that system does, some of the nuance of the workflow there, and then also what your customers are trying to do to combine these two systems together. So if you go out and you survey your customers and say, hey, we want to build a QuickBooks integration. What do you want it to do? An open-ended question like that is going to yield you an infinite number of answers, especially if your customers have been doing this manually for some time or have used Zapier or built their own thing. There's going to be all kinds of crazy stuff that you probably don't actually want to implement. And if you have a very small sample size, that can be even more detrimental because you're looking at one specific use case and building an entire product around it. So that's why I always say that you need to have an opinion when you build these integrations. Your customers are buying your product and your partner's product because they're not experts, most likely, in whatever the thing is that those tools do. They're definitely not an expert in the systems, right? They are paying you for the system that you provide to make their lives easier. And they are also paying you to integrate into the other tools that they use and to tell them more or less how that should function, right? Or to have a strong opinion about how that should function. If you have an opinion and you have some sort of idea about how this integration should work, you're able to put it out into the hands of your users and gather feedback quickly, right? Versus trying to survey and talk to a billion companies and figure out what the patterns are. I will always say, you want to have an informed opinion. You don't just want to be shooting from the hip. But if you work in product, if you work in engineering, like you probably have a general sense of what your product does and how it should operate with another system. Build some basic flows, document it, say this is what this thing does, and put it out into the world with some trusted customers, see what their feedback is, and then you can iterate your way to success versus spending 6 months requirements gathering across, dozens of companies that all have sort of patched and duct taped this thing together in this really unique way that's special to them. I know there's a lot of anxiety about building integrations to systems that are highly customizable, like something like a NetSuite or a Salesforce comes up all the time. And in my 20 years of working on these projects, what I have found is that customers would almost always rather make a slight change to their business process in whatever that system is to use the thing that you offer them natively and that you're going to support, and that they don't have to design, build, or pay for themselves outside of your contract. So I always say start there. We, here at Pandium have hundreds and hundreds of companies using NetSuite integrations across just a handful of versions. Our customers have made them very flexible, which allows many customers to use them. But they came forth with an opinion, said this is how the NetSuite integration works. Here are the options that you have. And folks do find a way often to sort of massage their own business into fitting into that box with some exception, right? There's always going to be some exceptions. But having an opinion will make your life easier. It will make your customer support life easier. It'll make your sales team happier, and it'll make your customers happier as well. So that's our top 5 tips for today about building integrations. I hope that this was helpful. If you want more tips, tricks, we're going to make some more of these videos, some more shorts. Hit me up on LinkedIn and let me know what you'd like to hear more about. And also check out our blog, pandium.com, where you could also find our podcast, Between Product and Partnerships, and learn more from experts other than me about what it takes to build great partnerships and integrations in the SaaS world today. I appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you out there.